if we have a little look, if you kind of want to follow the notes as we go through here, which I think is a good suggestion, have a look at page 3 and then on to page 4. That's where we're at in terms of the notes. The board work, however, I will say, if you haven't done so already, make sure you have a little copy beside you, because again, there's going to be a lot that goes up on the board that isn't down on the notes, so we need to take down a little bit of extra information as well. For those of us with a keen eye, you can see that there's kind of like a little bit of a mathematical equation almost, a little bit of a sum on the board. Something I tend to do with my English classes the entire time is try to show students how formulaic, how almost mathematical English can be, and that if you stick to certain blueprints and certain structures, you actually have to be rewarded. All right. This first one here again is P plus I plus S equals S. Okay, and effectively, guys, this is 17.5% of your grade right there in that little mathematical equation. If you don't know this information going into 5th year and then on into 6th year, you will struggle certainly to get that H3 and above. Okay, so it's very, very important that we kind of take this information on board. PIS we're going to look at in terms of linking all this together, all the information that we're going to explore now, and that'll give us our final S here, our suggestiveness. So we'll have a little look at that as we go on. So guys, on page 4, top of page 4, we'll begin to look at the concept of pattern. All right, have a little think. So as we go through this, so again, those of us again coming from 3rd year probably might be a little bit more kind of comfortable with this at the minute, because obviously in 4th year it might be a case that you didn't do a lot of poetry, so you might have forgotten a number of things. But actually think about some of your kind of even almost your 3rd year poetry stuff, maybe Dulce et Decorum Est, for example, one of the poems that you may have dissected and may have tried to understand to the best of your ability. So have a little think about a poem potentially that you know. Failing that, have a little look at some of the poems that are there in the notes for you. And again, you can use that as a focal point as well. Pattern, imagery, and sensuousness. In terms of our first element, pattern here, there's 3 elements that you need to be looking at, okay? Something I used to tell my students the entire time, both day school and grind students, was I was like, guys, this is something that students don't do, you know, for whatever reason. It's the easiest thing that you can do with regards to both unseen and study poetry. I don't know why students don't do it, etc., etc. I need to stop saying that now, because my students in both grinds and day school have started to adopt this, and they've started to be rewarded for it from the department as well. So it's something now that my students are doing pretty consistently. And again, it's standing to them massively, okay? It's, as I said, it's the easiest thing to identify when you're looking at a poem. It is what's called form versus content. So effectively, you're looking at form, guys. A synonym for form is structure, is the shape of a poem. And then content, obviously, is the body of the text, what's being said. And effectively, what you're going to ask yourself is this poem conventional? As in, is this a conventional poem? Is everything I'm reading here, does it make sense, okay? Or is it unconventional, okay? Now, typically, if it's an unconventional poem, there's every chance it could be what's called an extended metaphor. I would expect, even a 5th year, that you guys understood kind of the concept of extended metaphor. Potentially not, though. We say never assume anything. But an extended metaphor is when the entire poem is written about one thing, but actually the meaning is something completely different, okay? In that case, it would be a very unconventional content-wise. Structurally speaking, poems that have kind of 4 stanzas or 4 lines each, or 2 stanzas, maybe 8 to 10 lines each, we would describe them as being very conventionally structured poetry, okay? If they have a more narrative feel, more story poem feel, we describe them as unconventional, okay? You'd have heard me say the word synonym a lot so far in terms of today's class. Very important. I'll talk about why synonyms and why vocab is very, very important in 2 seconds. But a synonym for this is uniform. You might describe the poem as being incredibly uniform. And if it's not, if it's a very odd structure, you think, is the entire poem maybe one couplet? Is it only 2 lines long? In which case then you would describe it as incredibly non-uniform. Is the poem maybe 4 pages long with no line breaks at all? And also you would describe that as very non-uniform, much more of a narrative-esque poem, okay? Again, going back to that term synonyms for a second, why are synonyms so important? Why is vocab choice so important? If you have a little look up here, something I mentioned at the very beginning of today's class, I said that what we do within my classes is we have a column, and we have it's written on middle board typically, or else far board here in terms of the classes at the beginning of every class, and it says vocab or vocabulary at the top of the page or top of the board, and 30% written beside it the entire time. And that's to remind you guys constantly that everything you do in your English Leaving Cert, 30% of every time you put pen to paper will be based on your vocab and will be based on your word selection, the words you elect to use within your answer. Okay? So something that, again, I won't go through in terms of today massively because we don't have time, but this is our marking scheme for everything that we do in our Leaving Cert. PCLM, Purpose, Cohesion, Language and Mechanics. And that language mark there, vocab choice, is 30%. All right. So invariably what happens in the grinds is we have a column here. As we go through the class, we end up probably with around 10 to 15 new and exciting words that are there for you guys to use going forward. All right. Exciting, again, I've said before, is probably a superlative. It's much more useful is probably a better term. All right. But again, nonetheless, vocab, very, very significant. Conventional, unconventional, uniform, non-uniform. Already that's our beginning. Okay. A second element. So if you need to pause there, guys, and take that kind of information down in terms of structure, the shape of the poems, the content, if you need to take that down, do so now. If not, the second element of our pattern is our sound techniques. All right. So our sound techniques basically tends to be what gives the poem a huge amount of pattern. You can have internal rhyme, you can have end rhyme, things of that nature. You can have, your rhyming scheme, A, B, that kind of thing as well. And then we go on a little bit further and we have our terminology like alliteration, assonance, consonants and sibilants. Typically, guys, what would happen, to give you a flavour of how the grinds would work normally, again, if the room is packed full of students, I'd say, guys, right, take 60 seconds, 2 minutes, have a little think. What sound techniques are you familiar with regards to studied or unseen poetry? Have a little think, jot down as many as you can. If you want to do that now, again, I've kind of given you the 4 kind of sample ones. We might just crack on in terms of that. So alliteration, for example, as we said, repetition, the repetition there as well of our letters, normal letters, gives us alliteration, gives us a pattern and creation of pattern that way. Assonance is our vowels. So again, that's repetition in terms of pattern as well. The owl hooted, for example. Sibilants, as mentioned, is S and C. So the soft C there, again, the cynical snake visited the circus. That's all sibilants there. Now, you might be sitting there, there'll be a couple of little one-liners that I'll give you today, guys, and you kind of think, oh, well, great, thanks so much for that, Gavin, that's kind of changed my life. But something as simple as that, if you come across like a harsh C sound, like the cat coughed, and you say, oh, well, that's sibilants, that's wrong, and it's very wrong as well. So again, that obviously impacts your grade in a negative manner. So the little one-liners that I'll give you, we just need to adopt and take on board, okay? Consonants. As I was saying it there a second ago, you might have said, oh, yeah, I know these 3. I've never heard of consonants before. Consonants, guys, is the endings of terms, and that creates a pattern as well. So not so much end rhyme, not so much like the man sat on the mat turned out to be the cat. Not so much end rhyme in that regard, which would be an AA rhyming scheme. It's more, to quote, I suppose, a third-year poem for you guys, Dulciet decorum est. In all my dreams before my helpless sight he plunges at me, gutter ring, choking, drowning. That ing, perfect example of consonants there. Okay, guys, another couple of terms here. Onomatopoeia is a great term. I was explaining to the 6th years a little earlier on. I was talking about kind of this can be seen as a white flag and a red flag. It's a white flag in terms of unseen poetry. If you identify it and you say, the poet's use of onomatopoeia here was incredibly striking or was totally applicable for, again, of where they used it, etc., etc. And that's great. White flag. It's a red flag, though, however, if you misspell it, if you get it wrong, all right? So make sure that we're getting it right. That is how we indeed spell it correctly, so just make sure that we are okay with that. And again, let's call a spade here. Let's have a little think about why we might potentially sign up to English Grinds, why we are even watching, I suppose, May in terms of our summer months, is to try and separate ourselves from the herd, separate ourselves from the crowd. Onomatopoeia, I would argue and say it's pretty mundane, it's a pretty well-known technique. However, you now will be able to respond to both studied and unseen poem, especially Emily Dickinson as well, who we'll look at towards the end of today's class, With a little bit more information, terminology like euphony and cacophony. Any musical students at home watching this video will be aware of euphonous and cacophonous tones. Euphony these are actually homonyms in terms of they actually sound like, I suppose, the action itself, or in terms of onomatopoeia. Euphony is our soft noises, okay? So lake water lapping, for example, again, that's euphonous tones. It creates whimsy, it creates magical, I suppose, a setting in that regard. Cacophony is our harsh noise on the ear. Cacophony by nature is a harsh noise. And again, those are a bang, crash, slap. Typically, cacophony will create kind of harrowing, ominous settings. Again, the mood will be kind of dour or depressing, or again, violent and visceral. And then euphony, again, as I said, will be whimsy, will be magical, will be much more jovial and positive, okay? Again, now, consonants, onomatopoeia, euphony, cacophony, malleable, these types of synonyms, these types of terms that we've hopefully kind of never come across. Now we're kind of adopting these and we're taking these on board, and we're starting to see, again, our vocab grow, and even before we even start back in fifth year, hopefully. All right. There's, as I said, in terms of our sound techniques, there's another couple we could put in there, like our end rhyme, internal rhyme, those kind of things. And maybe even refrain, for example, which is an element of repetition, which we'll talk about next. But again, that's plenty for now. And in terms of the creation of pattern as well. So those are things that we should look at going forward. The final element of pattern, guys, and we'll speed it up after this as well, is, as discussed there, repetition. And hopefully this is kind of another idea of how we kind of cement the idea of vocab and vocab choice and separating ourselves from the crowd. Repetition is great. It's obviously very easy to identify. Repetition exists heavily in poetry. It's very, very easy to identify. It's how we deal with it that separates us from the other students sitting the exams. So terminology like refrain, as mentioned a second ago, this is when we get kind of a lot of repetition. It gives it the poem musical qualities, almost like a psalm or a hymn, that kind of like religious kind of connotations. Anaphora, guys, is when something is mentioned at the beginning of a poem and then kind of periodically returned to throughout the poem. And lineation is kind of one really strong line that a poet really, really likes, and they tend to repeat that then throughout the poem as well. All right. So again, you might go back into your day school classes, even after this kind of microcosm of the time spent in terms of the actual classes that are spent with me, and you might sit down and you might be going through a poem very early on in fifth year. One of the students puts their hand up and says, I really enjoyed the repetition within this poem. And then you, on the other hand, now can raise your hand and say, yeah, well, you know what? It's mentioned at the beginning of the poem. It's then systemically or periodically returned to throughout the body of the poem. This is actually much more like anaphora. Or the repetition being used here gives it much more of a musical sense and a musical tone. So therefore it becomes refrain. Again, little simple techniques in order to bolster your paper, to separate yourself from everyone else. Okay. When we consider what we're looking at here in terms of arguably both unseen and studied poetry, but if we just pause on unseen for a second, very much a finite amount of time, a finite amount of written text as well, 1.5 to 2 A4 pages. It's important that we separate ourselves early on as well. So little things like this will help massively in order to get 5% of our grade, which is a very, very achievable, as I said, very achievable 5% as well, guys. All right, that's pattern. Have a little look at done. Okay, that's the pattern of our poetry and what we need to look at when we're dissecting our poetry. We'll speed it up a little bit, guys. In terms of the notes themselves, if you're on to page 4 of the notes, you can have a little look at the imagery elements. Imagery made up of a couple of things here. First element is at the bottom of page 4, which is the concept of the literal to the abstract, almost like written on the board there. Kind of looks like a little 6-minute workout video, but it's the idea of something literal, like an actual tangible thing. Emily Dickinson, for example, hope is the thing with feathers. Perfect example of the literal to the abstract. In that poem, we are given a literal object, the tiny little bird, to describe something much more abstract, which is a thought, an idea, which in that case there is hope. All right, so that's something that poets do the entire time, guys, is they take something literal to describe something abstract. I had it on the board moments ago as well. Have a little consideration about extended metaphors also. All right, so when we're dealing with extended metaphors, again, that tends to be the literal to the abstract as well. Okay, second aspect with regards to poetry, which is very, very important for you as students, and it's something that you guys need to consider, is vocab choice, okay? A little side note here on this is that in poetry and poets in general, there's no word anywhere in a poem that's there by accident, okay? Poets are very deliberate. They will often go through maybe even countless number of drafts from the first poem that they produce versus the one that we read in class, okay? So to get to that stage, it's been painstaking, it's taken a lot of time, all right? So there's no words in those poems there by accident, okay? And that's something to be mindful of, all right? Which means, and it's great for us as well, because it means that we can take then any word that's in the poem and really put an extra amount of emphasis on it. The really good students watching this, maybe not right now at the beginning of 5th year, but maybe towards the end of 5th year and certainly on into 6th year, what you guys will be able to do is you'll be able to identify these words, maybe through my help as well, maybe through yourself, and you'll be able to identify it, and what you'll actually be able to do is almost write half an A4 page on one word, all right? We'll have a little look with Dickinson, for example. Like again, even if you look at the soul has bandaged moments, and you take again like the term like a bomb that's included within one of the latter stanzas, and that the fact that the bomb is in there, that's vocab choice. That's done. It's done deliberately. It's to show, I suppose, the pent up emotion, the pent up power, and the rage that happens with Dickinson when she finally escapes from this kind of, well, as we'll look at it, but this escapes from this kind of feeling of those dark feelings that she has. Okay. But vocab choice, guys, very important, something to note as we go forward, and we'll have a little look at that in terms of our unseen poetry as well. Finally, comparisons. Finally, in terms of our comparisons, this is basically poetry. This sums up poetry, okay? It's effectively something, a little one-liner I use with my students the entire time is that, you know, when you find a really decent simile or a metaphor, or even when you're responding to the poem in general, and you say, for example, that comparisons are used by poets so that we as mere mortals can relate to the information, or that we can access the information. That little one-liner, you know, we as mere mortals, it shows a little bit of personality. It shows your voice coming across in your answer. Students often ask me, you know, is this okay to do? Can you include that, you know? Because it's kind of jovial, it's kind of like almost past remarkable. And to be honest, it's phenomenal, it's excellent. Candidate or examiners gravitate towards it massively because, again, as we said, we get a sense of who you are and again, your ability to respond to poetry as well. Something I constantly talk about in my classes is about this conversational tone that we're looking for. When we get on to our studied poetry, you'll hear me talk about the two different types of studied poetry answer, point by point or poem by poem. The point by point tends to get on a lot better nowadays because you're trying to include that conversational element, that conversational tone to it. All right. But comparisons, guys, again, this is where I would say to you in terms of my class, you know, pause 60 seconds to 120 seconds. Take the 2 minutes to have a little think. If you want to do that now and stop the tape, you can. I'm just going to launch into it as well. But again, if you want to do it and try and think and try and draw from your 3rd year experience, your 4th year experience, do so now. I would expect that you guys will be able to come up with certainly four staples in terms of our comparison, similes, metaphors, personification, pathetic fallacy. Those would be the 4 guys that I would expect you guys to get straight away and be comfortable with, you know, similes, using like or as, metaphors, making comparisons without using like or as. I'll pause there for a second, guys, and it's something I tend to do in the grinds as well. Put a little plus, and I'd ask you to put a little plus beside that as well. It's such an innocuous, it's such a small thing, but basically the reason why I have metaphors with a plus there is to remind you guys that metaphors are stronger than similes. Now again, we're sitting at home going, great, that's life altering, you know, that's such a big thing to know. But in reality, what it allows us to do is now when you're responding to either unseen poetry or potentially studied poetry, you could respond with, I found it terribly interesting the way Emily Dickinson elected to use a metaphor here rather than a simile, full stop. This shows us how strongly she felt about X or whatever the topic is. So now what we've done, guys, with that little plus sign there, I've hopefully shown you a little bit of what I mean by impact. You've come up with 2 sentences that's arguably probably about 4 or 5 lines, you know, the guts of half a paragraph, and you haven't even referenced the quote yet. you know, that's your response by simply knowing that metaphors are stronger than similes. Now, I've no idea whether, you know, it ever came into Emily Dickinson's mind to use a simile here rather than a metaphor, and then, you know what, she actually felt, you know what, I'm going to use a metaphor instead. I've no idea. But you are responding, and it's impacting. You're saying, you know, I found it terribly interesting that she elected to use a metaphor, you know, thus proving how strongly she felt about it, because metaphors are stronger than similes. Those are the little one-liners, guys, that are the differentials. Those are the ones that are going to separate you as a fifth-year student from your other fifth-year students, okay? So just be mindful of that. Personification, human characteristics to non-human entities. Pathetic fallacy then, again, this is when the weather or atmosphere reflects the mood. Not affects your mood. That's not like if it's raining outside and then you feel sad because it's raining. No, it's when the weather reflects the mood, as in the central character, either in the poem or in the actual Shakespearean text or in one of your comparative texts, that they're angry and they're upset and therefore it's a storm and it's rain outside. Okay, so the atmosphere reflecting the mood of the lead protagonist, antagonist. Okay. There's a number of other comparisons that we could use in there as well. Things like oxymoron, for example, one like paradoxes. One that I would 100% put on the board here now and get you guys to make sure that you know and jot down. It's something that you guys should know since first year. If you don't know going into fifth year, it's very important that you take this on board. It's arguably one of the most used techniques like across the sixth year or fifth and sixth year, I suppose, poetry, is juxtaposition, which is a dramatic change in theme, tone and mood, okay? It's something to be mindful of. It's a very, very significant point going forward. There's a number of other different comparisons that we could use within there, guys, as well. You know, you could even use, like, say, for example, hyperbole. Again, similar to juxtaposition in that regard, that it's not a true comparative technique or a comparison technique, but nonetheless, hyperbole, you know, massive amount of exaggeration. We, on the other hand, have an ability to kind of understand what should be said versus what is said with regards to that over-exaggeration, for example, okay? Superlatives, we could jot down as well. Superlatives, again, the most extreme version of a word that can be used, so therefore you're comparing, again, what word has been used here versus maybe potentially a weaker word or a stronger word, again, if we're looking at superlatives, all right? So, guys, I've said it before within this kind of online class, if there's information that's going up on the board here and you've never seen it before, and I would argue that if you're saying 60, 70, 80% of what's going on the board here is brand new, well then again, consider the grinds. You know, again, this is going to help you out massively. It really is going to bolster your information, the ability, and your information, I suppose, or your ability to put this information down on paper as well, all right? So that's something to consider as well. That's our imagery, guys. That's pattern imagery. Those are the three components that we need with regards to imagery. Take a little screenshot there if you need to before we continue on. Once you've done that, we're going to look at the sensuous nature of our poetry. Again, we're very much nearly finished here, and then we'll jump into our unseen poetry. If you have a little look at the top of page 5, for example, we have, I suppose, our 5 senses. I did mention to you about aesthetic language. I said that what aesthetic language is an ability to evoke a response within the reader. We did speak about impact, your thoughts and feelings. It is very much a sensory evocation as well, all right? So be mindful of that. You can see at the top of the page it says sight, sound, touch, taste and smell. Maybe in your copy, jot down the 5, and beside that, besides sight, you're going to jot down the term visual. So anytime you get colour, an excessive amount of detail, if the imagery is quite visceral, vivid, visceral again, hopefully guys, vivid, you know, hopefully you guys are getting this information in terms of the vocab and you're understanding again how we cement this 30%. If it's visceral, vivid, a lot of colour, a lot of detail, we describe it as visual. In terms of hearing it, we describe it as aural, so it's aural information, and that'll be a lot of the sound techniques that we spoke about, alliteration, assonance, especially onomatopoeia, euphonous and cacophonous tones as discussed. Touch is what's called tactile, and this will be anything to do with weather, if it's hot or cold, if there's a vibration, a jolt, anything along those lines. We say it's tactile, that we can touch and we can feel it. In terms of smell, which is important, guys, for any poets that tend to focus heavily on nature, cut grass, for example, anything to do with flowers, those kind of things, we bring in the term olfactory imagery, which is again a smell. And as I said, then the final one, which is taste, is gustatory. Now, I've mentioned a couple of times before, very rare that we get like kind of tasty, delicious poetry, but if you get anything to do with kind of sour qualities or sweet qualities, anything to do with honey or something along those lines being mentioned, you now are separating yourselves, especially with these two, maybe even tactile as well. You're separating your paper from everyone else's. When you start to look at terminology, maybe if the poet's talking and it's a vignette, it's a moment of nostalgia, and they're talking about maybe they find maybe their dads or their granddads maybe old jacket and hat and coat or whatever, and that they can get the smells off it. Now you can respond to, you know, the olfactory elements there, really add a sense of nostalgia, really give us a good concept of the poetic persona or the confessional nature of the poet and the poem itself, all right? That's the level of caliber, that's the response we need to be able to give when we're responding to both unseen and studied, okay? Guys, that is pattern, imagery, and sensuousness. That is the information we need to know when we are dissecting our poems. You'll note the fact that I use the word dissection a lot as opposed to read. From 50 year on, guys, you shouldn't be reading anything for enjoyment, certainly in terms of the English material externally. Yeah, it's great to read things and continue reading, but we are dissecting our poems, we're dissecting our Shakespearean text. With regards to our poetry, that's the information we're looking for, and it gives us what's called suggestiveness. And suggestiveness, guys, is on the middle of page 5 there. Effectively, what suggestiveness is your ability to respond to the poem using this information here. All right? So, from now on, everything we've done so far, guys, in the 45 minutes we've been talking together, pattern, imagery, sensuous, the 3 elements here, the 3 elements here, the 5 elements here. You are trying to find that information within both unseen and studied poetry, and then it allows you to respond to the suggestiveness. Now, what this is what the poet was trying to say, trying to put across within their poem, and your interpretation, mainly your interpretation of the poem, all right? It goes without saying, guys, if you look at this information here, and you get incredibly visceral, violent, you know, ominous, harrowing imagery that's being used. You know, the pathetic fallacy is dark and somber and worrying. Well, then obviously the suggestiveness is going to reflect like your impact, or the impact it had on you is obviously going to be that, you know, that it was a very worrying, it was a very depressing poem. You know, likewise, if it's jovial, positive, you know, real, like, you know, naturalistic imagery, flowers, sunlight, well, then again, your suggestiveness, your interpretation is that it was going to be positive, it's optimistic, again, it's jovial, all right? You just have to find this information, and that helps you, again, respond to the poem itself. You can see that there on page 5, guys. I have a little bit of white space that says vocabulary builder. And effectively what I mean by that is your ability to use statements to respond like, you know, it was my interpretation that, or, you know, the poet's, as I said, visceral or violent imagery really stood out in stanza 2, okay? Or, you know, that the aural qualities allowed us to enter into Dickinson's world, something along those lines. To give you a formula, as I said a couple of times already today, I'm big into the kind of mathematical formulas. To give you a formula, effectively what it is some element of a response, so some element of impact, what you thought, what you felt, okay, your opinion, whatever it is, to some stylistic element, okay? You know, I was shocked by how, so that's your response, I was shocked by how musical this poem was, all right? Or I was shocked by the euphonis, the juxtaposition between euphony and cacophony within stanza 3. That's what gets us a H1. It's definitely what gets us 5% of our grade, because again, something we'll talk about now in a minute. We don't have time. We don't have time to get a full interpretation. You have 6 minutes at a push to dissect this poem, so you need to be able to take as much from it and as quickly as possible as well. All right? Final little aspect, you have a little look there again at the end of page 5. It's all about how the poet puts it across and why you felt the particular way that you felt, all right? So how is here, and that's the why there as well, all right? Goes a long way. If you want to pause, read the bottom of page 5 there, read it a couple of times. Again, it goes a long way to explaining effectively everything that we're doing here.